Must have been 10 or 12 years old. I was a below average skateboarder at the time, one of the only ones in my small city. Skateboard gang of one, would terrorize the local school driveways and stuff. It was fantastic. Never harmed anything, not a graffiti dude, just a skateboarder. And I remember my mom saying, hey, next week we're going to just your normal pediatric checkup, before school starts or whatever. And I was like, great. But at that time, I was having pain in my wrist just from falling on the skateboard all the time, right? That's what you do when you're below average skateboarder. You fall a lot. And so I was falling. My parents bought me these wrist guards that had a really hard kind of plastic thing on the bottom and on the top of my wrist, but they hurt even worse when you fell with those. So I didn't wear them when I was skateboarding, but I wore them when I wasn't skateboarding all around. I wore them at night because my wrists were hurting so much. And my mom was like, why are you wearing those at night? My wrist hurt. So when we went to the pediatrician, just for a normal checkup, she goes, hey, let's get your wrist looked at. So Dr. Chavez was my pediatric doctor for my whole childhood. And he's like, hey, let's run a quick x-ray. They had an x-ray machine. Ran an x-ray. Turned out my wrist was broken, had been broken for months, and I left a normal little checkup for school starting with a cast on my arm. Very upset by that because it interrupted my skateboarding, my below average skateboarding. What I'd like to do today is take a look at a very small text, actually 5 verses, just 5 verses, which is pretty unusual if you know me. In fact, the 5 verses, we're going to zoom in on only 2. And what I'd like to do is ask God to give us a bit of an x-ray to see where might you be aching in your life a little bit, and if the x-ray of this short, beautiful passage might identify something, might identify a place that has a little hairline fracture or a bone that's out of place. We're going to ask God to do an x-ray on each of us individually and us as a family in this text. And it's all about love. And that already makes it a little difficult. But this passage is about love, the real kind of love, the hard truths about love. And we're going to ask our question, how does our love that we really walk in every day, which all of us do in some sense, fit the picture that we see in Jesus? So if you've got your Bibles, please pray that little tickle in my throat stays away. If you got your Bibles, we'll be in John chapter 13. As you recall where we've been in the Gospel of John, this is catching us up on context, and our text will do that really, really well. This is near the end of Jesus' ministry years on the earth, right? We don't know exactly how old he is. Some think that he's in his early 30s. Some actually put it a little later, in his late 30s. But we know that he was active somewhere between 3, 4, perhaps even 5 years in his public ministry. Most people see it as 3 years. And this is near the end of that. The Gospel of John is the one who gives us that sort of record because it counts the number of Passover feasts, and of course those happen once a year, that Jesus was a part of. There's 3 of them in John, but there's one unnamed feast that may be another. So if you add a year in the front of that, it may be 4+ years that Jesus was active in his public ministry with his disciples. Maybe just 3, but here's the last one. And what we saw last week is Jesus sitting down at the Passover meal, which is very, very special, with his 12 disciples. I always thought and still do think that the women disciples were probably there. He doesn't mention them at all in the context, so maybe they're meeting somewhere else. But Jesus is meeting with, at very least, 12 men and himself, except for our text here. Because at the end of the text last week, after Jesus takes the form of a servant, very shocking humility, and washes the feet of every disciple, including a man named Judas, the only disciple that was from Judea around Jerusalem. He was from a village called Kirioth, so we call him Judas Iscariot, which is an Aramaic Jewish, Judas, the man from Kirioth. And he was, from the beginning, even though Jesus chose him as a disciple, never a believer in Jesus. Jesus says that. Some of you have never believed. Jesus says, did I not choose the 12 of you, and yet one of you is a devil? And he was set to betray Jesus. Jesus, in his perfect foreknowledge, saw this coming. But yet at the Passover meals, we saw last week, the place of honor at the table, Judas sits in. And when Jesus takes the cloth and washes all of the disciples' feet, Judas's feet are among those feet washed. So this is a powerful moment. Then after that, when he sits back at the table, he says, do what you do quickly, and Judas gets up to leave. The very next breath at that table is our text today. And we start with a reminder because the context is important. Context is critical. Who is in the room, who is listening to these words of Jesus is absolutely critical. It's not 12 men. It's 11 men. We must realize that. It's not 12 men. It's 11 men. And from the Jesus' words in the rest of the chapters that will go forth, it's very, very clear that those 11 men are believers in him. He says, you have all believed. You are all clean by your faith in me, what I have said, that I am the Son of Man, the Messiah. Now, of course, he hasn't gone to the cross yet. They're still trying to understand that. But they are believers in him. So he's talking to believers. Now, what he's going to say is a specific kind of difficult. I think there are two kinds of difficult. There's a complex kind of difficult, and there's an important kind of difficult. They're not the same. Now, some of you, women and men, work in complex fields, medical fields, engineering fields. The complex difficult is like, hey, we need to build a bridge across this river, and it's on a fault line. And we get 2 or 3 minor earthquakes a year, one big one every 10 years. We got to build. That's a complex, difficult problem. The important kind of difficult problem is, hey, husbands, you're called to love your wives as Christ loved the church. It's not complex, it's just important and difficult. Hey, parents, you're in charge and being stewards of your kids to raise them up in health and safety and wisdom and faith, even though you don't have control over all of those things. It's not a complex difficult so much as it is an important kind of difficult. We're going to read a text today that everybody will understand. It's not complex, it's just important. And it's important in a way that makes it really, really difficult to walk out. Does that make sense? It's an important kind of difficult. 5 verses, that's it. Look at John 13, starting in verse 31. Therefore, when he, that's Judas, had gone out, that's where we pick up. Jesus says, that's one of those historical presents, again, in this text, bringing it back to life. Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I'm with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Not a complex difficult, an important difficult. To love one another is something that a small child can understand. To love one another as Jesus has loved you is difficult for the oldest saint in the room. It's an important kind of difficult. And so that's what we want to focus on. There's a couple of things at the beginning of the text. Jesus says, now is the Son of Man glorified. He's quoting the prophet Daniel there, the Son of Man. He uses that term a lot in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not so much in the Gospel of John. There's a couple of times, but he says, now is the Son of Man glorified. He uses even a past tense, but he knows that, and he's speaking at this is present. And the Father will be glorified in him, and the Father will glorify him. Lots of glory up there. He's saying that what's coming is going to be beautiful, even though it's not going to seem beautiful. And that's the second part. I tell you, little children begins verse 33. That sounds kind of condescending, right? As if somebody goes, oh, bless your little heart, okay? That's a southern way of being very condescending, okay? Oh, bless your little heart. That's not what Jesus is doing. It's a term of endearment. It's the only time it's used in the Gospel of John. But in 1 John, the same author writing a letter to a church, he uses it 7 times. He loves this phrase, and he learned it from Jesus. Little children. He says, I'm with you a little while longer, and then I'm going to go away, and where I'm going, you can't come. He's talking about death, burial, resurrection, ascension to the Father. He says, but I will come back for you, and then you'll come with me. He says that in other places. But then we get to the two verses that we want to focus on. Verse 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. This is hard. The first thing I need you to do is see a paradigm with me. If we see this paradigm, everything else will be seen through that, okay? Everything else will be seen through that. Right at the beginning, we have love one another. It's a command, he says, even a new command I give to you, love one another. But then it's qualified, even as I have loved you. Do you see that? We're going to get to that, but here's the paradigm. You don't love others ever as God's children. You don't love others out of your own source material. You don't love others out of your own strength of will, your own resources, your own store of love. You love because you have been loved by Jesus in the greatest possible way. You see, I want you to love others, one another, and he's talking about other believers, including the other disciples in the room, expanded out to the church. Of course, Jesus loved the world. God so loved the world. Jesus loved the world in the Gospel of John. We're supposed to love the world. Yes, we're supposed to love each other in the same way, but also different. As I also have loved you. So here's the paradigm. You are beloved by God. If you have faith in Jesus, God calls you beloved, beloved daughter, beloved son. And only beloveds can become the kind of lovers that Jesus is talking about here. That's the paradigm, right? We start as beloved, and then we act out as lovers of others. That's the paradigm. You got it? And now we're going to look and really just kind of dissect. These two verses are just going to be on the screen the whole time, okay? We're going to go a lot of other places. We're not going to put anything else on the screen. It's very, very simple because there's a lot to unpack here. Love one another, new commandment, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples, that you have love for one another. Lots of love, right, in the text? But it's difficult. The first thing that I want to tell you is love has largely become rather empty as a word and as a concept, right? Love is, as John Mark Comer will call it, has become like a junk drawer. We put everything in there. I love my wife. I love my pillow. I love my kids, and I love sushi, all right? I love driving through the shadows of trees, and I love other people's pets, right? Also ours, but I love other people's pets a little bit more. So it's like love becomes just sort of everything. I love Jesus, and I love, that one pair of shoes that my friends gave me or whatever. And so love becomes a bit of a junk drawer thing that we have to start there because Jesus is going to tell us, love one, and this is the word agape, the verbal form of agape. It's God's brand of love, a selfless, sacrificial kind of love. But first we must ask, okay, if love for us is just this junk drawer concept, what we really need is a redefinition of what that actually is. And this text gives us that. It gives us that in droves. It gives us that in resplendent beauty, extravagant plenty. Because he says, I want you to love one another even as I have loved you. So that's where we need to pause for a little bit. So the first thing is, love has largely become rather empty as a concept. But two, Jesus' love becomes the standard of comparison. It's what I will call today with you the master model, okay? Jesus is our master, and he gives us the model of his love for us. So Jesus' love is what I'm going to call the master model of love. And he's going to say, I want you to love each other in the same way that I have loved you. That's the same idea in Ephesians chapter 5 for husbands and wives. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ Jesus has loved the church. That's a high bar. We can stop there, and I start there when I do premarital counseling. Hey, husbands, your job is to love your wife as Jesus loved the church. You're like, okay, cool, that's big, that sounds good. Let's continue reading in that passage. And who gave himself up for her. We're like, oh, hold on, we should have stopped earlier. That sounds harder. Yeah, it is harder. Because Jesus' brand of love, the master model, is really high. It's really big. And we're going to look at that at length. So I want to say 5 things about the master model of Jesus' love, and then we're going to apply this, okay? Is that all right? Again, just 2 verses. We're drilling down deep. This is unique, but I've been very excited to do it with you. So what kind of love is Jesus' master model of love? The first thing I want to say to you is this. Jesus' love begins with the other person, always. Jesus' love begins with the other person. Let's think about the woman. Here's how we're going to apply it. Each time we talk about these things, we're going to try to see it in the life of Jesus. Then we're going to ask how it appears in your life individually and how it appears in our life collectively as a family of a church, okay? Jesus' love, number 1, always began with the other person. His focus, this is agape love, was on the other person. Think about the woman with the issue of blood for 12 years. She spent all of her money on every doctor she could find, ritually unclean, couldn't go to the synagogue, couldn't go to the temple. It was basically scandalous that she crawled up and touched him because she's unclean. But Jesus' cleanliness isn't compromised by our uncleanliness. It flows in that direction every other person. Read the Old Testament, something that's unclean touches this person, that person becomes unclean. That's always how it flows, except in the life of Jesus. Cleanliness flows outward. And so when an unclean woman touched his robe, his cleanliness moved to her and she was healed. And he did not chastise her. He bent down, had a conversation with her and said, your faith brought you to me. Your faith has made you well. Jesus' love begins with the other person. When you think about Mary and Martha, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, at the death of their brother, Jesus knew what he was going to do, and he could have come in to Bethany as Lazarus is dead 4 days, and Mary and Martha be very upset, as they were. They were very kind of, very vulnerable with Jesus. Hey, if you would have been here, if you would have been here. He could have come in and just shut them down. Hey, don't you trust me? Don't you trust me? Come on now, hold on. He didn't. He came in weeping, heavy. And he started his love with care for the other. Jesus' love always begins with the other. You recognize Paul's version of this, not in a separate chapter that's not about spiritual gifts, but the glue in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that attaches all of the context of spiritual gifts in chapter 12 and chapter 14. It's right in the middle. It's the glue that holds the gifts together. And he says, hey, listen, I can speak with angelic tongues all day long, but if I don't have love, I'm a clanging cymbal. I can have the gift of prophecy and the gift of knowledge and have mysteries explained by God, but if I don't have love, I am nothing. I can give my body over to the flames and become a martyr, give every possession away for the poor, but if I don't have love, it profits me nothing. And then you could probably quote it with me. He says love, and it's all agape. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not jealous or envious. It doesn't seek his own, on and on and on. I want you to hear the way Eugene Peterson translates this chapter in a paraphrase Bible called The Message. And it's not word for word translation. It's a paraphrase, and it's beautiful for its own purposes. This is the way Eugene Peterson has that passage, if you remember. He says, so no matter what I say, what I believe, what I do, I'm bankrupt without love. Listen, he says, love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut. Doesn't have a swelled head. Love doesn't force itself on others. Love isn't always me first. Love doesn't fly off the handle. Love doesn't keep score of the sins of others. Love doesn't revel when others grovel. Love takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. Love puts up with anything. Trusts God always. Always looks for the best. Never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Love never dies. I like that paraphrase. The first thing we see is that Jesus' love begins with the other. The second is this. Jesus' love, this extravagant love, fully coexisted with uncompromised truth. Now, here's the hard part. Sometimes we, in this junk drawer sort of concept of love, as we walk through this world, we're saying, okay, I got a choice to make. I love the other person or I am truthful with them. That's a false dichotomy. Jesus shows us how to actually do both at the same time. I'm not suggesting that it's simple. I'm suggesting that Jesus did it all the time. He loved the other, but never compromised truth. Jesus' love coexists with uncompromised truth. We see it in the Samaritan woman. John chapter 4. He goes and he stays, he sends his disciples away. He's in a place he shouldn't be. A woman comes up in the middle of the day because she's trying to avoid everybody else. He has a conversation with her. She's like, I don't have a husband. He's like, yeah, you've had 5, and the guy you're living with now is not your husband. She's like, oh no. And so he doesn't sidestep the reality, but he loves her, and he says, but I'm here to speak to you. I'm here to show you what you've been longing for. And she says, yeah, our people, the Samaritans, worship here, and when the Messiah comes, he'll teach us all things and tell us all things. He says, I am the one speaking to you. I'm that man. He loves her in a way that coexists with truth-telling. And that is a very master model way of loving. It's hard to do, but it's possible because Jesus shows us how to do it all the time. We can put our arm around a person and say, hey, I have something hard to tell you. We can put our arm around the person and say, I have something hard to ask you. We can wash the feet of someone who is going to betray us and say, I love you, even though I know the pain that you've caused. Jesus does this. Number 3, Jesus' love did not demand fairness. Now, this is going to be hard. I told you this is hard because he doesn't just say love one another. That would be hard on its own. But he says, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus' love did not demand fairness. And here's what I mean by that. In Mark chapter 6, we see this really, really hard day. The way Mark tells it, this really hard day in the life of Jesus. He sent his disciples out. They're coming back to tell him all that they've done on the missionary journeys that he sent them on. And then news comes to him that his cousin, beloved cousin, John the Baptist, has been loosed from his head, right? And he is heavy. And he says, guys, if you read Mark 6, guys, let's get in a boat and go off by ourselves. Because it's heavy. Gets in a boat and goes off by himself. People find where he's going. They show up there, and he's like, oh, well, he teaches them, heals them, even feeds them, and then tries to send them away to go off by himself. And they still are with him, and he comes back, and they're crowding him all the time. Never once does he say, guys, I had a really hard couple of days. What I really need is some me alone time. What he does is love them and not demand some false or shallow sense of fairness or balance. He says, I'm going to give this extravagant sacrifice of love, what we see in Jesus every time. Did he go off by himself? Of course, all the time he did that. But he doesn't demand his love a sense of fairness. How about your love? Can your love coexist with the truth? Can your love not demand a sense of fairness? Did your love begin with the other and start with the other? This is hard work, really, really hard stuff. Anne Lamott tells a story. 8-year-old brother, 6-year-old younger sister is very, very sick. What she needs is a blood transfusion to help her get over her sickness. They do some tests. None of the people in the family have exactly the kind of blood that she needs for the transfusion, except the brother. 8-year-old brother. So they come to him and they say, hey, you have the kind of blood that sister needs to get better. Want you to think about how, and they explained it to them, we're gonna hook you up to a machine. If that's okay with you, we're gonna take your blood and run it through a machine that pumps it into sister so that she gets better. An 8-year-old son says, can I think about it? And they said, of course you can think about it. He comes back in a couple of days, he says, I'll do it. And so they go to the hospital, Anne Lamott writes. He's in one bed, she's in the other. They stick him, he starts to cry a little bit because it hurts. It's okay. And he sees the red liquid go through the cord, in through the pump, and then into his sister. And he's sitting there. Tears are welling up in his eyes. Everybody says, are you okay? And the doctor leans in, son, are you okay? And he says, when do I start to die? And everybody said, what? And he understood totally different. He understood that the procedure was going to take his blood, all of it, and put it in his sister. That he was going to give his life for his young sister. That's why he took 2 days to think about it, and he said, I'll do it. And they said, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. Is your love like that? Mine isn't. Mine isn't. But Jesus' kind of love begins with the other, doesn't demand fairness, coexists with truth, is that kind of love. A couple more things. Jesus' love embraces the journey of the relationship. I don't know if you recall this, but it helps me to remember every once in a while that I am a disciple on a journey, and I ain't at the end yet. And the people that I'm in relationship with are also disciples on a journey, and they ain't at the end yet either. But sometimes what I want, if I'm honest with you, and I'm always am, I'm frank, saying, I want the other persons and people that I'm walking with to be very gracious to me and to remember I'm not at the end of my discipleship journey yet. But at the same time, I don't offer the same kind of grace to them. In a way, sometimes I think, why aren't you at the end of your discipleship journey yet? I'd really like you to treat me a little better. But Jesus' love respects and understands the journey of discipleship. I'll give you a couple examples from the life of Jesus. John and James, the two brothers, sons of thunder, right? John's the guy writing this, and he includes these embarrassing stories, which is a hallmark of authenticity. He, because of the pressure of mother, Mrs. Zebedee, comes and he says, Jesus, at the Lord's Supper, at Passover. Luke chapter 22, I think, tells us this. They're at the supper, and they begin to say, hey, who's the greatest in the room, Jesus? Who's the greatest? Jesus is like, come again? What are you talking about? And this is not the first time that that's happened, because James and John were walking with Jesus one day. Pressure from the mom says, hey, we have a request. In your kingdom, can we sit to your right and to your left? He's like, what? This is a very, very arrogant, very selfish, inappropriate question. And Jesus responds, hey, you don't know what you're asking. Peter, this guy who's constantly sort of open mouth, insert foot when he talks to people and talks to Jesus, right? He's always the one, he's sort of the leader. He's one of my heroes because he's just sort of out there. He is who he is. And at the end, at this meal, we'll see it next week, Jesus says, Peter, you're going to deny that you even know me 3 times. He's like, I'll never do it. He's like, yeah, you're going to do it. You're going to do it. And then at the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus goes, cooks him supper, asks him 3 questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? The words, yes, are important, but it's important that he asks 3 times to cover over, perfectly reconcile 3 denials of Jesus. Jesus' love respects and understands the journey of discipleship, the journey of relationship. How about yours? How about yours? One of the hardest things to remember sometimes is, hey, I stepped on that person's foot. That person stepped on my foot. This is an opportunity for growth and discipleship because we're both walking, hopefully, intentionally, both walking with Jesus in the direction of maturity. Lastly, Jesus' love bloomed when things got bad. That's Jesus' kind of love. That's the master model. And let me explain to you. We see it at the supper. Jesus' love, how do you see it in any starker contrast than when he washes the feet of Judas and sets him in the place of honor at the meal, knowing that he was the betrayer, knowing he's the only one in the room who doesn't believe. Jesus' love blooms when things get bad, when things get hard. Many examples of this. Nicodemus. Nicodemus is supposed to be a Pharisee of Pharisees, a leader. Jesus comes to him, and what he sees in Nicodemus, John chapter 3, is misunderstanding after misunderstanding after misunderstanding. But Jesus is patient, and he's kind, and his love actually seems to, in my opinion, grow a bit for Nicodemus, such that we don't know what happens in between, but Nicodemus is one of the people who buries Jesus in the end. He has come to faith in Jesus. Why? I think because Jesus' love for Nicodemus blooms and blossoms when things get hard, when things get bad. Peter's denials, we even see it at Gethsemane. In a couple of hours in our text, Jesus is going to pick up his disciples and they're going to walk to Gethsemane. That's where Judas brings all of the people to take him away. All of the disciples leave him in this time. Every one of them. Can you imagine that? At his most important moment, every one of them, including Peter, including John who's writing it, every one of them run for their own hides. Jesus is left alone. Taken and beaten and cursed, put in a prison, pulled out of a prison, taken to this person, gone to that person, back to this person, mocked and scourged and false accusations all the time. Everyone leaves. But Jesus' love in those moments, he doesn't say, oh, you bunch of fools, I can't believe you ran away. His love seems to bloom when things get hard. Jesus' love gets greater. This is the master model kind of love. And so now, a couple more points. If we're going to apply this text, now buckle up. You ready for it to get real? Okay, let's get real. Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you. Have you thought for a second how to love someone can be commanded? Normally, we don't think of love as a command. And you're like, in fact, if you force somebody to love, it's like you break down and corrupt the love itself, right? It's like screaming the word silence. Saying its name makes it go away. So you can't command someone to love, can you? Well, Jesus is doing it. So what he's doing is this. He's saying, well, love can be an emotion, can be a feeling, but it also can be very action-based. It can be set in services and something to do with will. We can actually decide to love. We don't have to fall into it like the poets tell us, right? And I love falling in love. When I fell in love with Liza, wow, beautiful. I hope and continue, we tell each other often when we're going on dates, we have beautiful seasons together. I'm falling in love with you all over again. That's a magical, beautiful thing. But that's not always how love works, because Jesus says, I'm commanding you to love. So there is something there that we cannot manufacture or create ourselves necessarily, but that we can step into with a decision, with a choice. And so if we continue, here's how it's going to get harder. If we want to walk in the master model, Jesus' kind of love, let's just be very frank with each other. Loving the lovable is easy. It's easy to love your spouse when, if you're married, when they don't do anything to frustrate you. It's easy to love your child when they're perfectly obedient. Those kind of hours when they're just sleeping right there, you know? The rest of the hours, it's a mixed bag. It's perfectly easy to love someone if they're just a still figure encased in hydrogen in a case over here. They just never move, never do anything wrong. You're like, yeah, that perfect love, easy. Yeah, of course, because loving the lovable is easy. But Jesus' master model tells us, no, my kind of love is proven when the other is unlovable. And that's where we get hard. Okay, so the next point. My kind of love, your kind of love within the church is probably harder in here than it is to love someone outside this room. Have you ever thought about that? When Jesus says to love one another, he's talking to disciples, and obviously the primary context of that is love for each other, love among believers, love among the church. Have you ever thought about how hard it is sometimes to love another believer, especially if there is injury, wounding, abandonment, hurt, than it is to love someone outside the church? Sometimes it can be much, much harder. Because when you love someone outside the church, and Jesus and God has called us to love all the world, and we do, we can love that person outside the church. I have many friends who are not believers, right? I had more when I was in college and late. Most of my life now is filled with disciples of Jesus. But even back then, when I worked at the restaurant, putting myself through seminary, it was easy to love these unlovable people because they weren't disciples of Jesus. They were just trying to figure it out. And in fact, loving them was really, really beautiful. But loving someone in the church who has hurt you can be very hard, can be very, very difficult, can be one of the hardest things that we are actually asked to do. And Jesus says, love one another. The Apostle John, who wrote this, if church history serves us correctly in the things that are written after the New Testament, John was exiled to Patmos, where he was given the vision of the book of Revelation and wrote that down. He was released from exile and went back and lived his later years in and around the city of Ephesus. And he was an apostle and a pastor in Ephesus. And legend tells us that the church and the house churches in Ephesus, if John came to one of their house churches, would very often ask, John, preach us a sermon. And the legend would tell us every single time he would get up and he would say exactly these words: little children, love one another. And then he would sit back down. That's the legend of the Apostle John. I don't think he ever got over this. Why? Because it was really, really important. It's not the complex kind of difficult, it's the important kind of difficult. And there were many times when he had to work out the love of people that were against him, people that were working against what he was doing. Sometimes it's harder to love within the church than it is to love outsiders. And so that means that we have to work on forgiveness and reconciliation and the hard kinds of the master model of love in Jesus. It is a huge, huge challenge. Moving on. Loving the other is God's favorite tool for your maturity. Did you know that? Think about it. The greatest things that have happened to you in life, if you were to write them out, it's probably things that happened in relationship with another person. The hardest things that have happened to you, the biggest wounds in your life, probably all of them in relationship with another person. My dad said this to me when I was a kid and it just crushed me. Or my mom did this, or my parents did this. This is what happened, and all of the hardest things in my life have to do with relationships. What about the greatest losses that you've experienced? There are people who have lost moms and dads, people that are close to them in this room right now, very recently. The greatest losses in our life are typically relationships. Why is that? If we put all that data back together and bring it back to the scriptures like this, God is trying to tell us something. God is telling us that your relationship and love for the other person is my biggest tool to mature you, to grow you, to help you become more and more like Jesus. We must understand that, or we'll try to avoid things and go through this life in relative isolation because relationships are hard. To love someone is to open up yourself to injury. To love someone is to open up yourself to be wounded. I think of Shaunti Feldhahn, the great sort of writer when it comes to parenting. She said this, when I had my daughter, I realized that my heart is walking outside of my body now for the rest of my life. And she loved her daughter, and she's like, oh, this is going to hurt. Yeah, it is. Yeah. C.S. Lewis says, to love someone is to open yourself up to great pain. If you don't want to do that, take out your heart, wrap it in paper, put it in a safe or a coffin or a drawer, and make sure it sees no one, feels no one, and therefore feels no pain. But know that if you do that, your heart will change. It will harden and become, in his words, irredeemable. So, to love is to open up to injury. But I also think that you probably know that the hardest things in life are the things that typically lead us to the best things in life. If we were to go through and say, hey, this is the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. Okay, tell me the story. Well, the story was really, really hard. That's because the beauty and the hardness go together, almost always. There's nothing of value in our life that wasn't difficult. That's just how life works. So God says loving the other is his favorite tool for your growth. And that's why house churches, I think, are going to be so beautiful. House churches, as we walk in those, are going to be beautiful because it really forces us to live in community with one another and go through the seasons of life. Go through hurt, go through injury, and reconcile with each other. Go through loss together and have someone support you. Go through difficult times and have someone come and apply some brotherly, sisterly discipline to you. Hey, man, I saw some things in you we want to talk about. House church is going to be this incredibly beautifully rich experience of what it means to actually mature together. Okay, last couple of things. My love for others, this is what Jesus says, is always a reflection of my nearness to Jesus. I told you it's going to get hard, okay? And so I'm stepping on some toes. I'm stepping on mine too. My love for others is always a reflection of my nearness and proximity to Jesus. That's what he says at the end. By this, your love for one another, all men will know that you're disciples of mine. So my love for the other is always a reflection of nearness and likeness to Jesus. I read a story of this missionary to one of the islands, many thousands of islands and island groups in the Pacific. He went to the Pacific. He had not been the first missionary there, but he was the first missionary in a long time. And so he goes, and he has a certain style. And so he goes to the villagers, and he begins to describe Jesus. Instead of talking about a biblical story, he begins to retell the story and just describe the person of Jesus slowly over time. And as he's slowly describing what Jesus is like and how he loved people and how he walked with people, he notices that the villagers are starting to smile and speak to each other in their language. And so he's like, hey, what's going on? And the villagers say to this missionary, oh, we know that guy. And he's like, what? He's like, that guy that you're describing, we know him. He's like, how do you know him? He was like, he was a doctor that came here about 20 years ago. And he lived in exactly the way that you're talking about. He loved us in exactly the way that you're talking about. He did all the things that you're saying of that, so we know him. He was like, whoa, okay. Of course, it wasn't the Jesus. It was just another missionary doctor that was there before him. But can people say that about you? Could an outsider, if we describe Jesus to an outsider, they're like, oh, I kind of know a person. I kind of know a person that resembles that. This is the master model of love. And our love for the other person is always some sort of evidence for our likeness of Jesus. That's what he says. Okay, last couple of things. The character of our love for one another is a grand display to a watching world. That's what he says. You are my disciples. By this all men will know that you are my disciples. Our love for one another, especially in the church, is a grand display for the world. Here's why. Because the world, think about it with me, we're almost done. The world is adrift without an anchor on a sea of counterfeit loves. They're trying to figure out, why doesn't that love satisfy me? Why doesn't this fill the void in my heart? I truly believe that because that's the way that I was. Every person I talked to who had an understanding of what it was like to be far from God and not a person of faith in Jesus have many, not all of them, because I think it takes some understanding, but many of them have these same stories. I was adrift on a sea of counterfeit loves. I didn't know it, but I kept trying to apply this, apply that, fill it with this, fill it with that. Nothing worked. So where are they going to come and how are they going to see it? They're going to see it in us. They're going to see it in the church. They're going to see it in followers of Jesus. So our love for one another is a grand display of Jesus' love for the rest of the world. In fact, are your toes properly stepped on? I got one more. In fact, it's the only biblical seeker-sensitive model of the church. If we build a church with things that attract and dazzle people, in order to keep people, you got to keep doing the dazzly things, right? What brings people is typically what keeps people. This is Jesus' model of church growth. Love one another well, and the world will see it and want to be a part of that. This is the only really biblical model of church growth besides the power of the Holy Spirit working through the church. The love for one another is the grand display for the world. Because the rest of the world is searching for this kind of love. They're looking for the master model. They're looking for the master. How will they see it if they don't see it in us? They must see it in us. That makes our job really, really important. Really, really important. I read a story this week of a new believer who came to church, and he had a rough kind of rock and roll back story and life story, and he was a brand new believer, and someone was saying, hey, you put your faith in Jesus. He's the kind of guy who rough, is just sort of rough to look at. My kind of people. I'm attracted to guys who are like, hey, they got tattoos all over the place and piercings. I'm like, you're my kind of dude. Let's get to be friends, okay? But this guy's like flames that were coming up to his neck, and so we invited to a church. The guy's writing this. He says, I'm inviting this guy, new believer, put his faith in Jesus, to a church. And the guy says, I only have one question if I come to your church. I only have one question. Will I meet people who act like Jesus? Will I meet people who look like Jesus? Will I meet people who treat me the way that Jesus has treated me? Now, that's a hard question. Wow. Because our love for one another is a grand display to the world. So finally, all of this, 2 verses, brings to this question. How will we mature our love for one another? How will we, as a church family, mature our love for one another? But we always begins with me. You can't say, oh, well, they got to get better at their love. I'm good. No. Okay, let's start with you first. Let's start with me first. But I can tell you, as a pastor, it's so deeply moving to me as I was prayerfully preparing this message, so deeply moving to me. If I could have my druthers and wishes full, I would love for the reputation and the legacy of Grace House Church family to just be about the way that we love one another. Just that. I would love for the people who are far from God, that work in Conroe, that work in Montgomery, that work in Magnolia, that work in the Woodlands, that work in Willis or whatever, neighbors on our street. Oh, gosh, I've heard of that group of people called Grace House, and I've heard that they love one another extravagantly well. That they love one another in the hardest ways, that they work through differences and injuries, that they are the kind of people that rise above the rest, not because of how flashy and high production value and how big and no, just because of the way they love one another. That would be my greatest prayer for this church. That's because of what Jesus has said. So, how will we mature and deepen our love for one another? Again, we always starts with me. So the big idea that I want to say is this. Relationships bear the best fruit out of the rich soil of Jesus' master model of love. There's a lot of words on the screen. I know that, okay? But Jesus' master model is this soil. And if we're going to love one another well, as Jesus says, in the way that he loves us, then we have to do it his way. Again, the paradigm that I started with, remember? We don't love out of our own resources. We don't love because we will it to be so. We love and become lovers of others. Why? Because God calls us beloved. That's what John says in his first letter. I want to invite you and encourage you, challenge you to do something this week. This week, read the letter of 1 John. Read the letter of 1 John over and over again. I read it a couple of times this week. It's simple, short, 5 chapters. You can read it probably 30, 40 minutes slowly. If you read the letter of 1 John, you're going to see this passage that we just talked about, 2 verses for 40 minutes. You're going to see that John never got over it. He's talking about it all the time. He's using the same language. He even says, I give you a new commandment, love one another. He's just quoting Jesus over and over and over again. And he's applying it to the local church. He's saying there could not be something more important. And what he says is Jesus gives us a master model. And the best relationships, the best fruit of relationships come out of that master model. The more we can resemble Jesus' radical, extravagant, sacrificial love for one another, the better fruit that we'll get to see. The better fruit. That's what I want for our church. And I think it's a beautiful thing to seek out together. But it takes all of us. Let me pray for you. Father, we thank you.